Hello, everyone. Welcome to Emily Media's weekly shortage panel. Today, the topic is U.S. policy and the Horn of Africa. And as usual, we'll be talking about the subject of the day in the middle. First, we'll kick off with what stood out for each of the panelists. I'm joined happily by Dr. Bridge, Taklai Gavramkel, Faisal Roble, Iskel Gabisa, as you see on the screen in that order. And we'll start with the highlight of the week. Luckily, we met last week, so we can cover what happened over the past week. Let's start with Faisal, uh, who was not able to join us, and he was in the Washington, where a lot of things happened. What stood out for you, Faisal, over the past week?
Well, I think the very topic of today's discussion is what stands up for probably most of us, but particularly for me. Ambassador Irvin Masinga's timely, timely speech to Ethiopia and to Ethiopia's political actors is really something that we all need to underscore, deeply look into the discussion, what he said in that presentation. It has a very far-reaching message, both for the world, for the donors, particularly the United States of America and EU, as well as for Ethiopia's political groups that seem to have taken 120 million people really into a quagmire. Who is wrong? Who is right? That can be discussed. But just let me underscore one message that really stuck with me, which I tweeted this morning. His advice to the PP government that it cannot fight its way out of the political, social, economic entanglement that Ethiopia faces is really the message that, in my opinion, drives home. Yes, he talked to all groups, but for the ambassador on his way to Washington this week and be meeting with Ethiopian groups on the week of June 3rd, for him to really tell the Ethiopian government stop securitizing the political issue the country is facing and thinking that you can fight your way out, to me, that's a message that is not hidden in any way or any shape. So I think I will underscore that.
Great. As you mentioned, Faisal, that will be the starting point for the main topic of the day for us. Thank you. Duke, what stood out for you?
Uh, well, I think two things stood out for me. It was not a great week in terms of humanitarian assistance and the data coming out of Tigray. We got bad news from the food distribution report. This week, only about 20,000 food rations went out. Last week, it was about 30,000. It brings the 6-week total down to around 2 million, which is a very critical point because that's where the vulnerability based targeting system becomes very important. Because if these are not getting to the people who absolutely need it most, then we're in real trouble. Then there are people that are starving. And there are people that are starving regardless. The second thing that stood out to me was the IOM DTM database was released, the data set was released for round 35, which is with the assessments they did of IDP hosting sites in December. They did the round 34 in September. It showed very challenging situations in Amhara, Somalia, Oromia, Tigray, where people were not able to access food. More than 80% of the people, more than 80% of the sites in Tigray had no access whatsoever to food. That was far and away more than any of the other regions that were surveyed. When they released the round 35 data just a few days ago after an open letter that had been written about it, when they released this, they just didn't ask the people in Tigray, the people in Oromia, the people in Somalia, the people anywhere outside of Amhara. And Amhara was the only place that they asked, do you have access to food? Now that's consequential because this would have been the first assessment after food restarted, after food aid restarted, and to not have that question, either they didn't ask the question or they didn't release the data, to just slam the door on 3 million IDPs is unacceptable. And hopefully, I believe they have a team in the field now doing new assessments. Hopefully, they'll correct that error. But this was a grievous mistake by the IOM DTM. Thank you.
Thank you for that important update, Druk. Sgal, what about you? What is the highlight for you?
It's not a particular thing, but two curious performance reports from Ethiopia that seem disparate, unrelated, but they're really interlinked in my mind. And it's kind of related to the overall topic of today, U.S. policy towards Ethiopia as articulated by the ambassador in Addis. The first report is about the performance of the economy that I read in Addis Standard, which the report is that $3.56 billion in foreign exchange, import-export earnings, about 2.5 billion had already been achieved, and that constitutes about 70% in 9 months. So the report says that Ethiopia is ahead of the schedule of performance review. Now, to be sure, this is actually down from the peak in 2019, 2020, which was 4.4 billion, and the fact that the planned goal was 3.56 itself also shows that it was really about $1 billion less than the peak of import-export trade. The other report that is related to the economy is that the Ethiopian economy, the size of it doubled in 6 years, and this was really trumpeted by the regime and its political operatives as a great achievement. We all know that GDP growth captures everything, including military spending. So in terms of human development index, it means really little. So if you look at the human development index, Ethiopia has this year actually fallen to 176 in the world. It has fallen by about 3-4 ranks, and so it's 176 in the world. So you compare it to what was presented as a doubling of the Ethiopian economy in 6 years. In terms of what that growth does, it's not really a big deal, because, as I was just saying, that defense spending in Ethiopia has grown by 70 to 90% over the last 5 years. Now defense spending is about 7% of the budget. It was 2% before in 2018, is now grown to 7% of the Ethiopian federal government's budget. Foreign exchange reserve is only, according to the Ethiopian National Bank, is only sufficient for only 2 weeks. Ethiopia is also, as we know, is one of 3 African countries that have defaulted on its debt. The pro-poor budget of the Ethiopian government, according to UNICEF, it has fallen from 70% to 33%. Now, and of course, there are other issues like the IDP has increased from about 200,000 in 2018 to 10 million, about 10 million today in the country. So these are the realities, but Ethiopia was really rhapsodizing this week about the doubling of the size of the economy. The other news item is the speech that the Prime Minister gave at the inauguration of a new hospital, a military referral hospital in Bishoftu, where the Prime Minister really boasted about the strength of the military. What was curious for me was that he was comparing the Ethiopian military with the time of the Derg, which has been defunct, a regime that has been defunct for more than 30 years now. And how that could be an achievement, I don't quite understand that you compare the Ethiopian military with the Derg military and boast about it is just something that I cannot understand. He extolled the Air Force, for instance, because it now has a capacity of night vision or night flight by night, as the Prime Minister himself said. Night vision in the military aviation began really in the period after World War II, but it was even the United States military started to use it in the 1980s and then fully deployed it in the Gulf War in the 1990s. So what is surprising here about these two things? It's not that this is not the first time the Prosperity made baseless claims, but I'm really baffled by the reason why the regime has gone to great length to project its economic miracle and military prowess, comparing itself to the incomparable. Perhaps I suspect that there's one there is a real weakness in both areas. I don't need to go into it, but there is probably real tangible weakness in both areas that needed to be supported by the propaganda. So that is probably related to what the ambassador was saying. The situation in the country is really dire. You cannot continue this way. And that's what prompted the ambassador himself to come out in Addis, in the capital city, where the regime itself, and to make that forceful remark. And I thought these were really related.
Thank you, Oscar. Yes, we will, I think, raise that in the main topic as well. Taglai, again, special thanks to you for joining us after midnight, as you always do. So, what is the highlight for you?
Well, I don't think there is much to add from my side, but just to maybe to mention a couple of minor points. Right before I came on here, actually, I was listening to an sort of press conference by the vice president of Tigray. I think, I don't know if that is his official title of Taddesa or vice secretariat or something like that, where he made a number of pointers, but one of the pointers he made was that they are not making as much progress as they thought they would in terms of returning or repatriation of people in IDP centers to their homes in Western Tigray and in Southern Tigray. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, he had promised that by, I think, Southern Tigray, it was by the end of June. There were deadlines anyway. I don't quite remember the exact dates, but today he was saying that is unlikely to happen. And generally, he was expressing his frustration. So it doesn't look like that the condition of people in IDP centers is going to change anytime soon. And interestingly, the U.S. ambassador, maybe we'll come into detail later. The only thing he mentioned in terms of Tigray was that there should be a safe and dignified return of people in IDP centers to Western Tigray. He didn't mention about withdrawal of forces. He didn't mention about the security situation. He didn't mention about the fact that Eritrean forces continue to occupy a lot of Tigrayan territories. So I don't know how you could do dignified return of people when the condition on the ground in Western Tigray and in Southern Tigray hasn't changed. But maybe we'll come into detail later. I think the other highlight is related to the speech by the U.S. ambassador, which was the angry response by the Ethiopian regime, I think that the next day. And I think it was part of that angry response that the Prime Minister went to one of the military hardware production facilities, I think in Debrecen, where he was parading the latest military hardware. So it doesn't look like generally that the Ethiopian regime has taken too well to the speech by the U.S. ambassador. So just little details to what they have already mentioned.
Great. The last point I think will give us a good segue to the main topic. So yes, we heard the ambassador talking about what is happening specifically. Actually, he mentioned by name OLA the Oromo Liberation Army, and Fano. He qualified this by saying those who call themselves Fano. And Tafla, you mentioned the response. Addis Standard actually mentioned that specific speech as a new major policy address, or not new, but the United States Embassy in Ethiopia made a major policy address today. Ambassador to Ethiopia Ervin J. Masinga discussed Ethiopia's current security situation, national dialogue, transitional justice, the American KP, Yemeni Community School located in Merkaz. This at this standard reporting. Let's just hear a bit of the speech and then we'll get started, maybe with Faisal.
Does not serve you well. As in other parts of Ethiopia, it is innocent civilians who are suffering at the results of the continued fighting and battles. Many in Amhara are passionate that their cause is just. If so, you should be well. To those fighting in Amhara, to those who don't give up, make the effort to rebuild trust and seek the peace for which there is a process. Let me be direct. To those in Oromia, the OLA, you made a genuine effort to reach a deal at the negotiating table in Dar es Salaam. Don't give up. Make the effort to rebuild trust and seek the peace for which there is overwhelming public support. Too many people are suffering as the fighting continues. To those fighting in Amhara, to those that call themselves the Fano, please know that your rejection of dialogue does not serve you well. As in other parts of Ethiopia, it is innocent civilians who are suffering at the results of the continued fighting and battles. Many in Amhara are passionate that their cause is just. If so, you should make those arguments through dialogue and not violence. To those in Tigray, the TPLF, seeking to resolve outstanding issues such as internally displaced persons' return, I urge an inclusive, orderly, and dignified process that does not involve retaking the territory by force. Your full participation in national dialogue and transitional justice processes will be crucial to peace and stability, not just in your region, but throughout Ethiopia.
This was done in front of Mike Hammer, the special envoy to the Horn of Africa. So, Faisal, what's your reading? I mean, on it at the H panel, you have been advocating for a long in terms of what the US should do and can do and so on. So what is your reading of what the ambassador had to say in terms of the tone, in terms of the content, the timing and everything?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of Washington's frustration with the PP and Addis Ababa, period. They've been trying to work with Abiy for a long time. Multiple envoys have given a report back to DC that the prime minister is completely opaque and does not listen. He's not willing to accommodate not only what they say, but what comes from the gurus. And there has been really no longer a secret in Washington that all of them, I'm not mentioning names, frustrated, with the exception of one officer in the State Department who still seems to have a soft spot for Prime Minister Abiy, and that's already exhausting. I think I read in the text also, in addition to this speech, and basically the US is telling Ethiopia, you are in a bad situation. I mean, the symbolism of mentioning a civil war that America had hundreds and hundreds of years ago, brother killing brother, and then the legacy of that civil war is still haunting the social fabric of Ethiopia, to tell them that, and also remind you what has happened to the Ethiopian people during the fascist war. All these are telling the Ethiopian government and the political groups that you are playing with fire. Now, I think, people, I think he gave, in my opinion, the best advice to Ola: don't give up, come back to the table again. The question is, would America help OLA to have an equitable space to talk? That's one question. The second question is also for Tigray and TPLF's repatriation of displaced people. is America going to put its money where its mouth is? Because as we all know, DDR and repatriation requires hundreds and millions of dollars, which the Ethiopian government doesn't have, and nobody committed any financial resources so far to the post-war reconstruction of Tigray, and even for that matter, northern Ethiopia. So I think the ambassador and his team need to really put their money where the mouth is. I think DDR can be carried and repatriation, but where is the money? Show me the money. Ethiopia doesn't have it. TPLF doesn't have it. With the Fano and his words, I think people read it in a very negative way. I did not. When he said, those of you who called them, maybe a gap, maybe he could have used, because as I believe, this speech was edited and re-edited probably at the highest. If not Blinken, I think this undersecretary was advised about this speech, because it was a major speech at a major African country, at that Ethiopia. So it was not a speech that came lightly. So the wording could have been changed. But I think, in my opinion, this is something Fano needs to celebrate. In less than a year and a half, it has been recognized by big powers as a major player in the Ethiopian political scene. TPLF has paid a lot of price on this. Ola has been bleeding with its people for a long time. And for Fano to be in the center of the dialogue and be sitting next to, the big league, I think despite the gap, they need to take this as an opportunity and really come up with a leadership that can face the music the next time around. This is not going to be the last one. I think this is a prelude to how should we talk, who needs to talk. Compare Fano to ONLF, the Somali National Liberation Front, which has been struggling and bleeding for years and years, and nobody's mentioning because they put down their guns. So if I were Fano, I will overlook the language and the terminology, but I will focus on the opportunity given to it. So they should celebrate rather than decry about the wording. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Pascal, this is the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia's homepage saying U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia delivers policy speech. Hence our topic, the U.S. policy and the Horn. Well, we're focusing on Ethiopia, but I think that's a good lens to look at the Horn as well. So what's your take in terms of what the ambassador said vis-a-vis what Taklai was mentioning? The Minister of Foreign Affairs made a one-page press release in response to that speech.
Yeah, I agree with Faisal that it was a policy speech, definitely. I don't know if policies are delivered actually by an ambassador, because policies are policies. But this was delivered in Ethiopia. I don't know what the significance of the American Gibby is, that he had to go to Mercato in Ethiopia to deliver it. But the fact that Mike Hammer, who is also the president's special envoy to Ethiopia, was in the room, was sitting there listening. So yes, it was a policy speech. The question is, he is a diplomat, and I think he more or less used diplomatic language, did not infringe on the sovereignty of Ethiopia, but I guess the United States government felt like this has to be, the new policy has to be pronounced in the capital city. So that is kind of significant, that a policy shift had to be announced by the US representative, the plenipotentiary, as they say in diplomatic language, in Ethiopia. Now, I've heard some criticisms from a variety of corners of Ethiopians. This man, Ambassador Masinga, is the US ambassador to Ethiopia. He's not an Ethiopian. He doesn't understand Ethiopian issues like many Ethiopians understand it. His perspective is one of an American, and an American diplomat at that. His job is to protect American interests and promote American interests. It's not to resolve Ethiopia's problems. It's not his job. Having said that, I think the policy speeches has some important shifts. Number one, he said to all armed groups, including the government, the security-focused approach isn't going to resolve outstanding political problems. That's important. He's telling the Ethiopian government from the capital that what the government has been doing the last 5 years, the security focus, the use of the military to address political problems isn't working. For me, that is absolutely significant as an Ethiopian, that the United States government is actually telling the Ethiopian government in no ambiguous terms that the military approach is not working. Second, he said the solution is, and this is, to me, that doesn't mean that he's endorsing the national dialogue that the Ethiopian government is presiding over. He's simply saying the only way that Ethiopia could resolve their problems is through an all-inclusive, and I think that the society is polarized. He said it has to be inclusive, has to be transparent, and it has to be done without conditionalities. This doesn't jibe with what the government had designed as a national dialogue. He is simply saying that this national dialogue is not transparent, it's not inclusive, and it has a lot of conditionalities. But he said it should be unconditional. I think that is significant. Third, he said for it to be inclusive, prisoners must be released. It's to release the detaining and harassing opponents just because they criticize the government is not the way to go. They should be released. So he's after all, he said all of this could be done only after a nationwide ceasefire had been achieved. This simply makes sense to me because in a country that is engulfed with conflict, you cannot conduct national dialogue. He is a diplomat. For me, he has gone out of his way to articulate these things. That simply indicates to me what I said earlier. The situation in Ethiopia itself has become a matter of grave concern for an American ambassador to announce the new approach in clear terms. You said something about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I thought that was really childish. To be honest, it was childish for them to say, "Why did you mention the name of my opponents?" He just said, "This is the word that they used, mention." What must the Ethiopian ambassador say when they say there are two sides to this conflict? One is the government, and the others are the armed opponents. And he shouldn't name the names of these opponents. How does that work? Is that coherent? That you just talk only about the government and not others? And isn't the Ethiopian government itself, the military, the political leaders, aren't they actually using the word OLA in recent years? Wasn't the prime minister, when he announced the engagement with the OLA, used the same term OLA? So I thought that response was knee-jerk, childish, and unbecoming of a ministry that has a good record of crafting diplomatically savvy documents.
Thank you, Skell, for that. Taklai, again on the same speech. I mean, generally, what's your impression? But also, were there any specific content in the speech that attracted your attention, and why?
Well, I mean, in general, for the past 3-4 years, especially since the Tigray war began, I have been having difficulty working out what the U.S. policy on Ethiopia is, what is the interest that the U.S. is trying to go after in Ethiopia. Because when Abiy came to power, the belief among many people was that the U.S. was involved in his rise to power, and in fact, the U.S. government agitated for Abiy to come to power, and the reason for that was that Abiy was seen as a reformer, that he was going to liberalize the economy, that he was going to align Ethiopia with the U.S., and all the things that we have heard 1,000 times. Those were the reasons why the U.S. got involved and really worked hard to bring Abiy to power. But then one has to wonder what is the interest that the U.S. could practically get from Ethiopia with Abiy in position, because it has been very, very obvious for a long time that Abiy was never going to stabilize Ethiopia. So Ethiopia couldn't be the anchor state that it used to be for the US during the APRDF years, right? Because during the APRDF years, the argument was that Ethiopia might not be economically amenable to US interests, but at the very least, it could act as an anchor state. That was the argument, and it's a valid point. You could see that. But Ethiopia couldn't be that now, because Ethiopia is perpetually unstable. And from an economic standpoint, it's a war zone for the most part. So I don't see what the US could extract from Ethiopia. So I have been having a very difficult time trying to sort of understand, to work out what it is that the US is after in Ethiopia. Why is it so committed to supporting Abiy? So when I was listening to the speech, I was trying to find answer to that question as well. Now, in terms of the speech, the whole sort of the vibe, the shebang, struck me as something odd. Not because of any specific reason, but because I had never seen a speech like that, where an ambassador makes a speech in the host country about policy change about the host country. So it was my first time. Maybe this is an indictment on my inexperience. Maybe there might have been such cases in other countries, but it was strange in that sense for me. In terms of the main content of the speech, my view is that he was actually supporting the Ethiopian government, because what was he saying? He was saying that the people should accept the national dialogue, people should accept the transitional justice that the Ethiopian regime has proposed. That last time we had the discussion, we said that there are gimmicks, whether it's the national dialogue or the transitional justice, because they are being spearheaded by the very regime. The transitional justice, for instance, which people hope is going to be the mechanism by which perpetrators of crime in Tigray, heinous crimes, are going to be held to account through that transitional justice. But now the main sort of actor, the main author of the transitional justice is the Ethiopian regime. And the US is telling us to accept that process. So on the whole, forget the details, whether the ambassador should have mentioned Fano or not, or the ambassador should have referred to OLA in that tone or not. We could debate about that, but the main content of the speech was a call to various actors in Ethiopia, whether armed or unarmed, to support the initiative that Ethiopia is pretending to be undertaking, the transitional justice, the national dialogue, and the other little things that the regime is doing. So I actually don't understand why the Ethiopian regime shouldn't be celebrating, because on balance, on the whole, it's a support to the regime. And I was struck by that as well, why the US would want to support that, knowing that it is a facade, it's a sham process. So I think in that respect, I have a slightly different view to Eskel and to Faisal as well. The other thing that struck me was something that I alluded to earlier, when he sort of accused the Tigray forces and the TPLF of trying to take territories by force. He said that they should focus on repatriating people in IDP centers in a dignified and secure manner, but he didn't say how. How is it that the Tigray government could return people in IDP centers in a dignified manner to Western Tigray when Western Tigray is under the occupation of the very forces who had driven them out in the first place? So there is no way that could happen. There is no way that you could return people in a dignified manner without making sure that the non-ENDF forces are out and the Amhara forces are out, which is what the Pretoria Agreement if you also incorporate the agreement in Nairobi, because I think they should be seen as a unit, as one, right? Because it's an amendment sort of the Nairobi Agreement. And in the Nairobi Agreement, it clearly stated that non-ENDF forces and Amhara forces must leave Tigray, and the DDR of Tigray forces should happen concurrently to that. But he doesn't mention these things. So that also struck me as something very uninformed, to say the least. In terms of the Ethiopian regime's response, on the one hand, it's something that I would expect the regime to do, because the regime is, as we know, is sort of pugilistic. It always wants to fight, even for very, very trivial reasons. And I think the reason in this specific case is, Iskeel mentioned it, is because the ambassador mentioned Fano and OLA, and of course the Ethiopian government would be incensed by that, because it doesn't want the American government to acknowledge that these entities exist in Ethiopia, even though everybody knows they exist. So I think that is their main source of anger. But if they were level-headed, they should have embraced the call that the US ambassador has made, because, like I said, on balance, as far as I'm concerned, he is supporting the Ethiopian regime's sham efforts.
Thank you, Taklai, for that. Duke, you have been also advocating for US to speak out and for the international community in general. And do you see the ambassador's speech maybe meeting some of your calls in some form? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I hope this was a policy speech. I hope that this was that this signals a change in policy, that we're not just going to sit back and pretend to support or actually support the slaughter of civilians that's happening all over Ethiopia, that has been going on for the entire tenure of Abiy's prime ministership, or whatever he was before he was elected, but still in charge. I hope this signals a change. I'm not sure it does, but it seems clear that there's frustration from Washington and the fact that we can't bail this guy out again. I mean, we can't pretend that he's a rational actor. It's not just even in Ethiopia, but outside of Ethiopia, he's causing problems. Ethiopia is not the anchor state that it used to be. It's not the. I mean, it's something that we really have to look at and decide at what price, at what cost, do we value such close relations. I mean, we should have, of course, have warm, friendly relations with Ethiopia, but do we do that at the cost of the human beings that are suffering from this regime that we're helping to prop up, or that there are, you know, these rumors or speculations that we help prop up? I mean, at what point do we say, you know, do we do what the ambassador said and actually make it stick, actually adjust our policy to reflect the words that he spoke, rather than have that be sort of a shot across the bow and then we go back to business as usual? I also picked up on his discussion about, you know, that Tigrayans should, you know, refrain from taking territory militarily and allow IDPs to go back in a dignified manner. And yeah, he has no plan for that. All of that, everything that happens there has to happen between the major stakeholders in the federal government. They need to have a place to go back to. There's no place to go to at this point. So I feel like if it was my kids, if it was the ambassador kids or anybody else's kids who were stuck in a displacement camp for 18 months after the cessation of hostility, we might have a different opinion on things. I don't know. I thought the response from the Ethiopian government was, of course, predictable because they have become such a sensitive regime, as many do when they start killing their own civilians. There's a lot of sensitivity along with that, and no matter what he said, if there was one thing that they wanted to pick apart, if it wasn't this full-throated embrace of the regime policies or whatever they're doing, then they're going to get upset about it. And we've created that situation where if we don't go out and swear to whatever lies the regime tells, there's going to be a backlash. But we're just going to have to accept that backlash. I think we should start being honest and upfront, like the ambassador was. And I thought it was a good speech myself.
Great, thank you, Duke. So one question that people ask, given the timing of where we are today and where we were, let's say, almost 4 years ago. I mean, talking about ambassadors in Addis, US ambassadors in Addis, we remember 4 years ago we had Ambassador Michael Reiner, I guess, who made a speech at that time. This is January 25, 2021, where he said, Ethiopia's progress on democracy and human rights must be sustained. This is just 2 months after the war on Tigray broke out. And he's saying here, we encourage Ethiopia to continue its courageous efforts to introduce and strengthen its political, economic, and security reforms. This is the ambassador speaking from Addis back then. And come November 2024, we might see Trump coming back to the White House. I mean, I want to be wrong. You can comment on that as well. So do you see any sustainable, talking about sustaining democracy and human rights here, sustaining this policy that Ambassador Masinga spoke about in Addis? Faisal.
I think this, when this was uttered, I think he was being over-optimistic. So I would not really take that to the bank. I think I agree with Duke. I think it was not a policy shift. It was an expression of Washington's frustration with Addis Ababa, period. They have been trying to talk with Abiy, midpoint, what they need from him, what he needs from them, and what the other groups need. After all, U.S. policy toward Ola did not change because Mike Hammer was part of the facilitators in the Ola/Ethiopian government meeting in Arusha. They were willing to also do the same facilitation for Fano and Ethiopian government if accepted. This is not new. It's just what's new is that the Washington team has been working or trying to talk to Abiy behind the scene, and they are hitting the wall. If you go back history from the special envoy that President Biden sent to Addis Ababa when he came, Chris Kunt, who was very close to the president, things have been deteriorating, and even the level of engaging Ethiopia has been downgraded. So for the ambassador to give such a speech at a Yemeni former embassy camp, it shows you that I think America is reaching to a point, not changing the policy to engage Ethiopia constructively, but downgrading where it usually used to put Ethiopia in the past. What the issue that Tekla raised, like, what is the advantage for the United States that it needs to make sure that Ethiopia stays stable and what? Of course, that's really the critical. Until now, Ethiopia used to be the anchor state, both in terms of the size as well as in the area of security. Today, the United States is warning Ethiopia not to stabilize the region. If any one of you have read the off the press but not distributed Ethiopia's the grand strategy towards the two waters, the Nile and the Red Sea, any person who is an observer of the Horn of Africa would be shocked for Ethiopian leadership at this particular time to reiterate the Zigwa era and the Aksumite era and what they had and how they access to the Red Sea, and make that as a policy base to say we have to have Red Sea access, whether that's in Eritrea or in Somalia. The regional destabilization of Ethiopia is a huge, huge weight sitting on the shoulders of Washington. In the past, and that's Tekla's issue, in the past, Ethiopia was used as a stabilizing factor, and the war on terror was a big marriage between Ethiopia and Washington. That is on the reverse today. Washington is worried internally and externally. Internally, that there could be a collapse of the Ethiopian system due to the civil war. And they are saying that behind the scene. They see the worry is that Ethiopia could collapse. It's already semi-failed state. The next phase is a collapse. And this discussion of Ethiopia as a failed state started in 2019 when Allah's war literally became a major issue. Ambassador Shin, Ambassador Carson, they started talking about this. And then came the Tigray war. Then came the Oromia war being a huge issue. Then came the Fano. The place is in an inferno. So if America forgets the internal, it will be missing. The same thing with the neighboring region. So I think this was not a policy shift, in my opinion, but it was as Taklai said, is a final call for Addis Ababa to put its act together. Maybe after that we may see, we may see something different. But as we know, America's policy, America can work with a dictator. If two items that America cares for works on its interest, security, and then the general stability of the region. And we don't have that in Ethiopia today.
Thank you, Faisal. Still, it's the same question on how sustainable is this, and of course, come November 2024, do you see anything change with Trump coming to the White House?
Oh no, I don't know if Trump is going to come back to the White House, and I don't know if it's going to change U.S. policy toward Ethiopia significantly. Maybe on the margins. The policy is of the institution, and changing policy is not that easy. Even Biden did not change by Trump's policy towards China. So there will also be continuity, whether the president is a Republican or Democrat. A policy shift is not policy change. Shift is different from changing. I don't think the United States is changing its policy from supporting the Ethiopian government to not supporting it. Not a policy change. But there is a shift, there is a movement that I am observing. And when I say this, it's fantastic. It's absolutely desirable that one actually maintains the healthy skepticism about what the United States does. But I am just listening to the speech and trying to make sense of what that speech portends. I'm just listening to the phenomenology of the content of the speech. I don't know what the motivations are. I cannot know what's in his mind or what's in his heart. I don't know. I think the United States government wants to support the Abiy regime because Abiy is their man. Abiy is their man. They are the ones that promoted him. I remember from the discussions within the EPRDF when he was elected, the opposition within the EPRDF was that he was a CIA man that should have been actually incarcerated at the time. The security head at the time, the security head actually proposed to the prime minister, to the then prime minister, to arrest Abiy Ahmed because he is a CIA man. They have intelligence reports on him. They knew that. And this was part of the discussion, the opposition to his being elected as the leader of EPRDF at the time in 2018. But But he was not imprisoned because the chief of staff of the chief of staff of the military was at loggerheads with the chief of security, and they were settling their own scores. And he asked the Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn at the time to write a letter to arrest him. So I think the United States government is not changing their position on Abiy. Abiy is their man, but he doesn't listen to them. He just doesn't listen to them. He doesn't listen to anybody. So they're just taking it out in public and telling him what they've been telling him in public. Look, my view is that national dialogue, and I think we talked about this last week, national dialogue, transitional justice, and the DDR, or whatever form it takes of the IDDRS, whatever form it takes, these three are on the table in Ethiopia. None of them can be successfully carried out or implemented without a ceasefire. There has to be some kind of ceasefire in Ethiopia. All of these can only be implemented as a ceasefire. So from listening to the ambassador, this is a recognition that there is a civil war in Ethiopia. It has different theaters. There was a Tigray one which ended with the Pretoria, for at least the guns have fallen silent in Tigray. But it was a part of the same problem, the same civil war. It's part of the same problem. There is war in Amhara. There is war in Oromia, and maybe some skirmishes in other places. But it is a part of the same larger process of a civil war in Ethiopia. And you cannot settle by individually signing a settlement like the Pretoria with Tigray, and then one with the OLA, and then one with the Amhara. That's not going to resolve the political problems that actually led to the civil war in the first place. This could only be resolved with a national dialogue. I'm not talking about the national dialogue that Ethiopia put in place. A national dialogue is going to be desirable if you want to address Ethiopia's problems systematically and holistically. And I think that's what the ambassador is saying when he says there should be a nationwide ceasefire. It's only after that, when the guns have fallen silent everywhere, not only in Tigray, but everywhere, when they have fallen in silence, that you can really get into this idea of a national dialogue. Look, this national dialogue does not include the OLF, for instance, a peaceful registered party. The ambassador calls for the release of political prisoners so that they can participate in a national dialogue. I don't think he is endorsing the same one right now. He is calling for one that he said should be inclusive, transparent, and without conditionalities. This one is not. This one, the one that the Ethiopian government has instituted, is not. It's inadequate. It's been rejected. So if you look at the sequence of issues, if you stop the civil war, the guns that fallen silent everywhere, it's only then that you can talk about political settlement, not piecemeal, but together. And that's what is called the national dialogue and transitional justice, and then DDR. Once you have resolved the political issues, as long as the political issues have not been resolved, there is no reason for national dialogue. There is no reason for disarmament. There is no reason for anything. So if you want to talk about Ethiopia as a deeply divided country, it is post-conflict that we can even talk about these three things. If the ambassador does not pay attention to the fact that there is war raging all over the country, well, then you can rightly criticize him. But I have heard a lot of criticisms as if he is endorsing the current one. I don't think that's what he's doing. If he is, maybe he's naive. But this is what Ethiopia needs, whether we like it or not. The political settlement in Ethiopia should be all inclusive, even those who are in prison. It has to be addressing real issues. So a national dialogue is going to be desirable. There is no way out for Ethiopia. Professor Marara had been calling for this forever. People have been calling forever. It has to be genuine. It has to be real. It's address real issues, and it has to include everyone, and it should be convened by a credible convener. That's not what exists. So I don't think the ambassador is really talking about that. So I think it should be welcomed. Would they be able to sustain it? How would I know? Would they be able to sustain this, that the American government is going to be consistent and always doing only what principle requires? That's not its history. But simply listening to the ambassador, I thought that was an encouraging, at least the first step that the American government has addressed, saying, you cannot resolve this militarily. You have to sit down and talk to each other as Ethiopians. That's what I think.
Thank you, Zkiel. About knowing what whether it will be sustained, I think you have been precise on what might come or not in the past. So I was confident you would say something on that. Talai, on the same question of what might happen with Trump or not, and also on how people are reacting to this. You mentioned about Ethiopian government reaction. There are other political actors, opposition parties from Ethiopia, from Tigray and elsewhere, and including Jawar, who had to write actually after a long time of not reacting on a number of things, reacted to this, specifically to the Ethiopian government's reaction to the ambassador's speech. So what is your take on what might come, whether this will be sustained or whether this be something that we will forget soon?
Well, if I could begin with whether or not there will be a fundamental change in terms of US policy if Trump came to the presidency in November. I don't think so. There was a paper written about US policy on Ethiopia. I think it would have been 2 or 3 years, titled "Who Lost Ethiopia?" So obviously, from the title, you could see the assumption is that the US had lost Ethiopia, and the authors make a number of interesting points. And one of the points they make is that US policy on Ethiopia essentially is not based on serious analysis. They say that generally Ethiopian issues are handled by GNM diplomats, that the policies are based on low resolution information, but their intelligence is not of the best quality. They mention a number of problems that give rise to why US policy on Ethiopia is fundamentally misguided. And they say that that sense of being misguided doesn't change whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats in charge. So there wouldn't be any fundamental change. But of course, because Trump will likely, bring on his own people, there will be change that would sort of emanate from the fact that the people are different. So, for instance, obviously, the previous U.S. ambassador, Tibor Nagy, for instance, was personally very, very connected with Abiy Ahmed, and the policies of the U.S. then reflected that sense of connection. And the current ambassador is slightly different, so you do see that very minor differences, but those differences are results of the personnel, not of fundamental analysis. So there is not going to be any fundamental change, and we actually see that, right? There is no. If it was the Republicans now, they would be telling Ethiopians to accept the transitional justice process, to accept the national dialogue, to accept the legitimacy of the government. So on those fundamental points, they would be the same. Now, the tone and the wording and stuff like that might be different, but on the fundamental points, I don't think there will be any difference. If I could mention some points that probably I should have mentioned earlier in terms of the speech of the ambassador. In his introduction, he said that every country has a right to defend itself. The assumption being that Ethiopia is defending itself. It was only the manner with which Ethiopia was defending itself that he took, not just him, if we are assuming that it's a US policy, so the US is taking exception to. It's not with the fact that Ethiopia is defending itself against, but who is Ethiopia defending itself against? Now, in the same speech, he was very complimentary actually of the OLA, but he said that the OLA were trying their best genuinely to reconcile their differences through dialogue. So he was very positive. He was very complimentary about that. So surely he can't be saying that Ethiopia is defending against a group that he himself is applauding for trying to resolve differences in a civilized manner. So the fact that he is on the one hand implying that Ethiopia is defending itself, while on the other hand is complimented the groups that presumably Ethiopia is defending itself against, how do we reconcile that? So those are some of the things that tell me that it's not a properly thought out policy speech. Surely, for instance, the OLA would take exception to that. They would not agree that they are attacking Ethiopia, and they are not attacking Ethiopia. It's two groups who have completely different views of political matters. The OLA would say, for instance, that the Ethiopian regime is not legitimately elected. So you can't say that it's a legitimately and democratically elected government, and you shouldn't be trying to topple it, because the very assumption will be something that they would not accept, the OLA would not accept. So it doesn't quite work, the basic premise that he's making when saying that. And of course, Duke and the others also mentioned that on the issue of Tigray, he completely hand-waved the complex problem of Tigray, of how Ethiopia is going to make Amhara and Eritrean forces leave Tigray, of how Ethiopia is going to provide a semblance of justice to victims, of how the various political parties in Ethiopia are going to trust the transitional justice process. So one of the things that I was really surprised by in the speech is that the ambassador didn't acknowledge the fact that major opposition parties in Ethiopia did not accept the legitimacy of the transitional justice process, the legitimacy of the national dialogue process. The entire speech, the entire request he's making is based on accepting those two sort of pillars of what Ethiopia should be doing. But the two pillars, the transitional justice process and the national dialogue, for very solid and sound reasons, the Ethiopian opposition parties don't accept. So in a way, he was undermining the legitimacy of the opposition parties, because he was not recognizing the legitimate concerns that opposition parties in Ethiopia have. So, for instance, Duke said that it was a good speech, and maybe one could argue that it was a good speech, but I mean, let's make this sort of hypothetical situation where he said that the Ethiopian government should drop the current transitional justice process and the national dialogue because they are not legitimate. The opposition parties haven't accepted them, and instead launch substitute processes where the opposition parties accept the legitimacy. So if he questioned the legitimacy of the transitional justice process and the of the national dialogue, and if he said that opposition parties have absolute right to question the impartiality, the legitimacy of those processes, then it would have been a really good speech, because that would acknowledge the concerns of the opposition parties. And also, if he made pointers about how, for instance, Tigrayan victims should trust the process, of how Ethiopia should try to bring Eritrean perpetrators to account, that would have been a very good speech. But he didn't do any of those things. Now, I do understand that, out of diplomatic courtesy, it wouldn't have been comfortable for him to sort of lecture Ethiopia about how to ensure justice and all that. So it's not that I don't understand that. But if it was a serious radical policy change, I would have expected those sorts of things.
Thank you, Taglai. Brooke, the same question. You were smiling when I mentioned about Trump coming and so on. So you can comment on that as well. But again, in terms of how sustainable is anything that, because people hope, okay, now this is the time. There is a speech made from Addis. very clear. Actually, the ambassador, when he started that part of the speech, he used, let me show our viewers, uh, he wanted to be, I think, clear and heard, where he said, let me be direct. So that's how he started that part of the speech. Let me be direct. So it's a direct speech, mentioning names. Actually, the Minister of Foreign Affairs were also mad at being direct and mentioning names, I guess. So, uh, again, talking about, let's say, weeks, months from now, where do we go in terms of, again, the topic itself, the U.S. policy in the whole? Do
Well, Trump, if Trump is elected president, there's no way to predict what's going to happen next as far as foreign policy. Now, of course, there are mechanisms and there's a process and everything like that. And Trump had a real hard time figuring out the process the first time around, and it saved the State Department for a few.
it looks like okay. I think we lost you, but I think
I'm
you are
sorry.
back now. So if you can restart.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, there. Okay. I was just saying that Trump is a wild card. If he is elected, I don't think anybody could say what could happen because there are structures in place to keep a president from just deciding to go off on a wildly different direction. But I think the last time Trump was in charge of the Secretary of the Treasury negotiating the dam with Egypt and then leveling sanctions that took away the human trafficking funding that was given to Ethiopia because they wouldn't come back to the table with Egypt. It's it you I mean, Trump does not have respect for any of these sort of structures, and so really it's anybody's guess what he would do. And now I know one thing he would do, which would be to replace the Secretary of State with somebody who's probably along the political religious lines of Mike Pompeo or shoot Rex Tillerson and those guys. He would pick somebody who has, and also Tibor Nagy. He would pick somebody who would be more amenable to Abiy. I mean, I think that's his sort of his block in the United States is the white evangelical Christian community seems to be very taken with them. And God knows what would happen with that. You might even see some faces from the past come back as having leadership positions at the State Department and the Bureau of African Affairs, or even as ambassador. Now, I wish I could say that would change the policy that much, but I don't think it would. I mean, even if Trump threw a real curveball and Ethiopian just decided to go a completely different direction, I'm not sure how much that would change the score. I mean, it could to a certain extent, but if you think about what happened in Tigray, the report on ethnic cleansing in Tigray, that was written by the State Department, and we can say it was written under Biden's State Department, but when you look at when it came out right after Biden right after Blinken came on as Secretary of State. It came out at a time, it would have been compiled at a time where the Trump transition team had not fully cooperated with Biden's administration on the transition of the presidency. So that report sort of looks like it's something that the State Department did almost under their own initiative. It would be very difficult. It would have had to have been the first thing Biden did when he came in office to say we need this report. So Biden has been no friend of the people of Ethiopia. Trump was no friend of the people of Ethiopia for the most part. I mean, either one of them. I think it's going to get worse between the U.S. and Ethiopia, no matter which one is elected. But is a policy sustainable for Ethiopia? Is really hard to say because you don't know what Abiy's going to do next. I mean, this whole thing we need a coastline sort of came out of nowhere. I don't know what he's going to want next. He's going to want a volcano. I don't know. you don't know what he's going to be up to, and so you don't know how U.S. is going to respond to it. But if it's Trump and he says we want part of Yemen, and Trump is a really strong looking guy, then Trump will say, oh yeah, it's a great idea. If he says something and was disrespectful to Trump, Trump will say, no, that's terrible. We should do something to stop it. He'll be more predictable, more easily manipulated. I think Abiy would take advantage of that. And I think he would take advantage of any new appointments that Trump would make. So I don't know what sustainability is going to look like with this. I hope that Biden's the president, although Biden is not doing a very great job when it comes to human rights. So I don't know where the hell we are. Maybe I'll move to Ethiopia. I don't know. Thanks.
Great. Duke, can you give us also your final thoughts? We're over the hour. So overall, what final thoughts for the show?
Sure. My final thought is that we need to get serious about humanitarian aid in Tigray, in places that need it in Ethiopia. The UN OCHA, the UN humanitarian response right now is completely off the is completely off the rails of what they're trying to do. They're gone completely rogue as far as looking at data, publishing data, making assessments, making real assessments of what's going on in Tigray. They're completely off the rails, and it needs to stop. There's a moderate investments being made in Ethiopia right now as far as humanitarian assistance. Those need to be large investments being made in humanitarian assistance. But how are you going to get humanitarian aid through these clowns that are just they are mischaracterizing data, not collecting the data needs to be collected? They missed a great opportunity to find out if food was really getting to the people, but that's evidently a secret over it. That's part of the new vulnerability-based targeting system, is that it has to be a secret, is whether or not people are getting food, whether or not people are getting the shelter that they need, access to clean water. All of that stuff should be done in a much more transparent way. It was promised to be done in a more transparent way by the World Food Program, and it hasn't been. And there is nobody standing in the United States. I would love to see some of this outrage that we see on, with different governments, different mostly domestic issues that we see outrage about. I would love to see some outrage about how much taxpayer money is being wasted by the fact that we don't have a partner in the United Nations, and we don't have a partner in the Ethiopian government who seems capable of counting how many rations that they're distributing while people are starving and people are dying. I don't understand. It is the level of incompetence that I'm seeing at this point from the humanitarian response is it's just remarkable. And I've been looking at this for 3 years in Ethiopia, so I've seen quite a bit of incompetence. And this, it's really gotten bad. If the IOM is hiding the data that they collected from Tigray, there are serious questions about why they would be hiding that data. If they didn't collect data from Tigray in the last round, there would be serious questions about why on earth they wouldn't collect data from Tigray in the last round. All of these things, and they need to stop, because human lives are at stake. And if we go into a country, we want to have diplomatic relations with a country, any sort of relationship, we don't care about human lives in that country, that we shouldn't be engaging in the first place. It's shameful what's happening right now, and it needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Duke, for that closing remark. Faisal, your parting thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think I will weigh on the issue of what would happen if Trump becomes, and I think I will just draw two possible scenarios. Given the fact that secretaries who took positions in the United States administration usually are influenced by the constituency that lobbies for those positions, and because of the fact that Ethiopian diaspora doesn't have a huge voting base, the biggest influence would come from NGOs and other groups who lobby around Washington, D.C. And I think I agree with Duke. If any group, two scenarios. One would be what we know of Trump, where he will be hands off and lower level type Heritage Institute former ambassador is like, the fellows that we know would fill the position, and we know what they have done already in Ethiopia. That's the one scenario. The other scenario is that a candidate for the Secretary of African, for the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and then the Secretary of African Affairs possibly could come from the ranks of the evangelical group. That's the most active, and that's the only group that have a sway on President Trump, former President Trump, if he comes. And I think that card works for Prime Minister Abiy. The support that he has, and the support that he had now, even with the former World Food Program president, or Mrs. The wife of former senator from Arizona. Those are the type of people who would influence, and my take is that Abiy will fare well from that kind of thing. But the other issue, just quickly, I'm confused a little bit, because I thought that the United States of America hired somebody at the rank of special ambassador to also do a white paper on transitional justice that will hold accountable for those who perpetrated crimes in the war of Tigray. And that paper has been prepared, and that paper was supposed to be an advisory report given to the PP. And my feeling, and that's where I thought the frustration is coming, probably the Ethiopian government completely refused to accept or incorporate the State Department's input into the transitional justice. Even if they run the entire show, the United States wanted to give it a blanket for creditability and work it. I think it's about close to 50-page white paper, which I heard somebody one time presenting. And that could be the friction that the two are having. And lastly, I do understand where the United States of America at this particular time is coming from. If you observe the Ethiopian political scene today, none of the groups that have muscle to flex, in addition to the PP government, Oromia groups, TPLF, and FANO, those are the three major active groups, don't want to work with each other. There is no platform. And when any outsider group looks at these three groups, they see bloodshed. They see bloodbath in the streets of Ethiopia. And if there was anything, and that's where Abiy's team always puts up front to EU and to the United States of government, that they presented themselves as the only alternative when you canvass the political scene of Ethiopia. Is there an alternative or we want the American government to forge coalition of these groups, bring them by force to the table, and then say one thing? But if there was something akin to the EPRDF in the prior to the fall of the Derg, my feeling is the discussion could change. The discussion could even be, one that where those coalition government groups can be used as a way to threaten the existing, or to, coerce the current BP government to come to the table with clean slate. Now there is none. And I think each one of them seem to be in contradiction with one another as much as they hate the government. And I think nobody can, at this point in time, fathom a process by which Ethiopian issue can be settled. And that's why the State Department, scholars in America, and think tanks all fear a potential collapse of the Ethiopian state.
Thank you, Faisal. Final thoughts, Gail?
I quite understand the United States has other issues about Ethiopia, like a superpower level rivalry with Russia, with China. They have to take that into account. I also understand that there is a middle power level rivalry in the Horn of Africa, in which the situation on the ground doesn't favor the position of the United States. So they have to take that into account as well. The ambassador is there to promote protect and promote American values and protect American interests. So in that context, I don't think Mr. Trump is going to be elected. That's my view, but it could be. But if he is too, I don't think he will be interested in Ethiopia. You know, Ethiopia is one of, you blip it if you want, this one is one of those shithole countries from his perspective. I don't really think he cares about Ethiopia. The only time that he cared about Ethiopia last time was because he was interested in the Abrahamic Accords, and that Ethiopia was used as a leverage to convince Sudan to recognize Israel. And even that didn't go well, because when Pompeo got to Khartoum, whatever Abiy told them about what he had done with the Sudanese did not pan out. So he got into his plane and he left. So I don't know if he's really going to be that much interested. I think his presidency is going to be consumed by revenge and settling scores domestically. And if anything, if he's concerned about foreign policy, he would be concerned about NATO and Russia. That's basically what Trump will be. So the Ethiopian issue would not come even on the radar screen of Mr. Trump, as far as I'm concerned. I think the Biden administration was engaged to the extent of sending his own emissary, Chris Coons, appointing 3 special emissaries, appointing an ambassador. I mean, that administration had been engaged in Ethiopian issues more than we think, or the Trump administration is. Now, with regard to the speech, I have heard this criticisms about Fano not being considered on par with OLA, making those remarks about the TPLF or the Tigray situation. Look, so the way I see it, OLA and the Ethiopian government is almost 80-90%. They have had agreement. It's just the prime minister who knocked it off in the last minute. So they're just telling the OLA, take it up where you left off in Dar es Salaam. You have made a lot of progress. Someone from that negotiation, not to the OLA, someone from that negotiation actually texted me at that time, said, we were so close. We were so close. So there are a lot of agreements there, which Mr. Abiy torpedoed by sending his national security advisor to Dar es Salaam. So to encourage them to continue and pick it up where they left off and then pressure the Ethiopian government, I think it's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. With the Fano groups, you know, there are 10 Fano groups in the Amhara region, 10 separate Fano groups. What they're saying is that if you really want to talk to the Ethiopian government, do something, have a delegation, don't reject it out of it, but have somewhere where the Ethiopian government, there are 10 Fano groups. In the reference to Tigray, was he saying, look, if you start a war trying to recover your territories from the north, the effort that we are trying to make here to stop wars is going to come crashing down. So please, don't do that, is what he's saying, because of what Faisal said. The situation on the ground is really precarious. It's precarious in Tigray, it's precarious in Oromia, it's precarious in the Amhara region. The possibility that Faisal just talked about right now, that this Ethiopian government might lose Arat Kilo. That's because that's the situation. You know that there are about 325 district waradas in Oromia. From the Oromia government's reports, OLA has forces in all 325 waradas. In all 325 waradas. The dark case scenario that Faisal just talked about is not a possibility. It is almost a reality. I think that's what spooks the American government. That's what I think. So it's really precarious. Even in the where there was an agreement, the Pretoria Agreement in Tigray is really a difficult situation. But they are trying to build on that. That's what they're trying to build on that. What they're doing is that, look, we have had Pretoria here. Let's have another Pretoria or Dar es Salaam for Oromia, and maybe another for Amara. Let's bring this thing a little bit down the flames. That's basically what the Americans are. So what I would say, my last word would say, understanding all the difficulties and understanding all the priorities, I do not expect the United States government to do for Ethiopia what Ethiopians must do for themselves. Peace can be brought not by the US, but by Ethiopians. And the US is encouraging. I had this in a meeting with Ambassador Masinga when he was at the State Department, where I said to him what Taklai said about having a prism through which they look at the different situations, but not really investigating. I raised the issue of criminology, that they have this Kremlin expert called criminologist. They have also those kinds of prisms in Ethiopia, and he pushed back on me. Now I want to take that back. Now that he is in Ethiopia, he's trying to do what an American ambassador could do. I want to encourage him. Words are not enough. Do more. That's what my last word would be.
Thank you, Scale, for that. Taglai, I just want, unlike others, not only the final word, as a kind of very brief comment, I want you to comment on what has happened in Addis Ababa today. The Eritrean movement called Brigade Nhamadu, which many recognize from their US, Europe, Canada movement. Actually, this is the Guardian reporting on August last year, specifically about this movement disrupting Eritrean government's propaganda and very active in many countries, including Israel and so on. For the first time today, they had their meeting in Addis Ababa, which many are considering this is, if sustained, a game changer. So your final thoughts and on this brief comment on that, Taglai.
All right. I just noticed that Iskel said Mr. Abiy, and I think that's a blasphemous indiscretion. You're always supposed to say Dr. Abiy. Don't want to go into Abiy's blacklist. Suspect you are in one of them anyway. I think, Getachew, you asked me about from before. I'm going to come back to your recent question, but before you asked me about Jar's comment, and I forgot to reply to you actually. So essentially, it's a long Facebook post, but he expresses his support for the U.S. ambassador's speech, and he laments the Ethiopian government's response. I think basically that is the summary of Jar. And charitable interpretation of Jar's post would be that he's trying to stay in the US's good books. And a charitable interpretation would be that he's jumping at every opportunity to push for peace. And I think that would be a reasonable interpretation, because for a long time now, Jar has been, pleading with the Ethiopian government to grab every opportunity for peace. And I think that is what he did with the post. And just one point about the speech of the US ambassador. I think one good, at least for me, one really positive aspect of the speech was that he publicly recognized OLM and acknowledged that OLA has been trying to resolve political differences through dialogue. I think that's a very significant thing, because historically, the problem of Western governments in Ethiopia has been that they don't tend to accept the legitimacy of rebel groups. But now he accepted that OLA exists, not only that it exists, but also that it has been trying to push for peace in a genuine manner. And that undermines the Ethiopian regime in a fundamental way, because now the Ethiopian regime can't go around and say that the reason we haven't signed peace deal in Tanzania is because of OLA, because the ambassador has said that the OLA actually tried genuinely to sign a peace deal. So that was a very significant and positive thing, and I just want to point that out. Just one more point before I come to your question, Getachew. I think the situation in Ethiopia is getting worse and worse by every day. Iskel mentioned the deteriorating economic situation in terms of the decline in export and all that. I wouldn't be surprised if inflation is soaring and if all other economic indicators are negative. I think that is what I would expect. Again, it's very difficult to trust data from Ethiopia, but if there was real data from Ethiopia, that would be the picture that they would paint. Everything is getting worse and worse. And there is a lot of, and this is something that I really know, there is a lot of anger and agitation in Tigray over the condition of the IDP people in IDP centers, over the condition of Western and Southern Tigray, the fact that they continue to be occupied despite the promise in the Pretoria and Nairobi agreement that they would be freed and that people in IDP centers would go to their homes. That hasn't happened. Not only hasn't happened, but also there is no sign that it will happen anytime soon. And that has become a huge source of frustration and agitation in Tigray. And as I said last week, desperate people could do anything. So that is something that the US and other diplomats should really pay attention to. And they have a lot of leverage. And that's very sad thing that they're not using their leverage, the US, the European Union, to push for the right kind of change in Ethiopia. Now, the policy speech was a good start, but the US has a lot of other leverage that it could pull if it wanted to. Finally, the Brigade Hamadu event in Addis Ababa, I think it was significant in the sense that Abiy must have allowed that to happen. And that tells you the status of the relationship between Abiy and Isaias. I think that is significant. And because there is a huge Eritrean population in Eritrea, if the movement gets some sort of traction in Addis Ababa and if the Ethiopian regime is supporting them, they could be a force to be reckoned with. But I think the significant point is that the Ethiopian regime is openly supporting a group that is trying to topple Isaias, and that just tells you how fractious the relationship between Isaias and Abiy has become, or must have become.
Great. I think that is a way to close today's show. Thank you very much, everyone, for your insightful contribution today, and we hope to continue on this. And we were hearing repeatedly from one of our reviewers, Mr. Ali Hore Aburus, who usually on our show advocates for Afar, and we want him to come as well because he was repeatedly mentioning we didn't mention Afar in our show today. So again, from Amhara, Afar, every community, any community doesn't deserve to be silenced under all this suffering. Actually, I posted today begs a question in terms of why Abiy is still in power, given what happened in Tigray, what's happening in Amhara, what has been happening in Oromia and elsewhere. So HPanel is making as its goal in terms of reflecting on what's happening, what should happen, what should be done. Thank you, Taklai, Duke, Faisal, and Iskel for your contribution today. Hope to see you next week by yet another topic.
Thank you.
Great. So our viewers in Tigrinya, صباح HBS ታይተ ፈጢሩ ንምንታይ ዝብል ምስ ኣባላት ቦርድን መስረትን ለተኽንገብር ኢና 7 p.m. Eastern Time ማለት እዩ ምስ ኣባላት ቦርድን መስረትን ያው ፐብሊክ ሚድያ ስለ ዝኾነ ሰብ ክርዳእ ዘለዎ ክረክቦ ዘለዎ ሓበሬታ ሕቶታት ኣልዒልና ክንዘራረብ ኢና ንኻልኦት እውን ንኩሎም ንዝምልከቶም እቲ ፀገም ዝቐረባ ግዜ ዝተፈጠረ ያው ለውፃናዮ ዝምልከት ኩሎም ዋላ ዝተቃረነ ሓሳብ ዘለዎም ፍሉይ ኣመለኻኽታ ኣሰራርሓ ዘለዎም ተሃልዮም ኩሉ ክፈልጥ ምእንቲ ንኩሎም ፃውዒት ጌርና ኣለና ፅባሕ 7 PM Eastern Time ተፀበዩና ማለት እዩ ስለተከታተልኩና ንመስግን thank you and have a good night from here your host was ጌታቸው አሰፋ good night and have a great long weekend for those in Canada